Despite what avant-garde authors say, if there exist any avant-garde authors, it does matter what the structure of your book is. And since the structure of your book matters, it does matter what you put in your chapters. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. So books, if you were born yesterday, are made of words, and they're made of sentences, and they're made of chapters. And these words tie together to create paragraphs, that tie together to create vignettes, that tie together to create chapters, which eventually tie together to create the entire book and create a complete story. Now, I've talked about paragraphs and how to view them in the past, the idea that you should view the paragraph as your most basic idea in writing, so you can check that out here or down below if you're listening to that on audio. But I haven't talked about chapters as a whole, because chapters are another section that is distinct within a book, so we should understand how they work and what to do with them. When I talked about paragraphs in the past, I said that you are trying to use this basic unit of writing to convey a specific experience. And chapters are similar. We are taking paragraphs and we are connecting paragraphs together to create a larger experience. In some cases, we are creating multiple narrative experiences within one chapter. In other cases, we have only one narrative experience, or one narrative section, if you will. But chapters do differ from paragraphs. And before we know what to put in our chapters, or start the process of figuring out what to put in our chapters, we need to understand our story overall. We need to understand the bigger structure to fit the smaller structures inside. This goes back to my ideas about outlining. If you want to check out my episode about that, you can check it out here or down below. But in my episode about outlining, I started with more ideas and bigger ideas. I wanted you to actually start with the beginning and the end of the story, because that creates the thread that runs through the entire thing. It's similar to the frame of a house. We don't start putting the little details in a house first. We actually start with the basic shape of the house. And it isn't just that we choose to start with the frame of the house and then get smaller and smaller and smaller until we're putting on the doorknobs, until we're putting the molding around the edges. We must start with the bigger things. They have to come first. Now, you may get away with starting with something tiny in writing, and I've talked about building stuff off of a very small kernel in the past. But you're going to be better served in your story if you choose to start with the larger picture or the larger story you have in mind. And to know what you should take on in each chapter, I believe it is a necessity to know the beginning and the end of the story. Because once you know the beginning and the end of the story, all you are doing is figuring out how to get from the beginning to the end. So how do you get from the beginning to the end? That is the question you are asking as you are trying to figure out what you need in each chapter. But you need a little bit more knowledge before you figure out what you should put in each chapter. You also should know how a chapter fits into a story, or how they function within a story. You can actually think of a chapter like a miniature story. The chapter has a beginning. It has a setting. It's telling the reader where everything is. It doesn't need to explain stuff as much as the beginning of the story. It doesn't need to introduce the characters as much as the beginning of a story. In some cases it might, but it doesn't in most cases, because we already have that prior knowledge. And after it introduces the characters, or after it has that initial setting, then it has an issue going on. In some cases, the issue starts at the very beginning of the chapter if it's hanging over from the last chapter, and then that issue ramps up. The character is vying with that issue and trying to get the upper hand depending on what that is. And at the end of the chapter, there's usually some sort of resolution, or in some cases, there is a cliffhanger that says, hey, there's still more that needs to happen in this story. It's not done. We need to finish these different things. Now, it doesn't look exactly like a story. There is a big question placed in the reader's mind in a larger story, and at the end of the second chapter, that question is not going to be answered. But we are going to want something for the main character to contend with. In most stories, the beginning of the story has very few things that the character has to deal with, and the things are very small. And as the story progresses, the issues the character deals with become greater and greater and greater. In some cases, the issues the character deals with are actually the same issue across different chapters. They're just ramped up and up and up until we get to a crisis point where we logically must know the answer to the question. But each chapter, in most cases, does follow a similar flow. We start with an issue. The character deals with the issue. There is a miniature climax. There is a miniature falling action during that part of the story. You can see this most evidently in the 7-point plot structure. If you want to check out my episode on that, you can check it out here or down below. The 7-point plot structure shows that the character is moving forward in the story, and at the beginning of the story, the character moves forward at a slower pace or does not have as much initiative when he is moving forward in the story. But during that 7-point structure, the character also has setbacks. When you look at that structure, you see there are pinch points, issues that the character has that are smaller, and there are major plot points where the character has bigger issues as well. But there wouldn't be much of a story without the character moving forward into those problems. In that story structure, it is necessary that the character is moving forward and trying to deal with those problems and overcoming those problems to face larger problems until he needs to deal with the biggest problem of them all. That finally answers that big question of the plot and breaks the tension in the reader's mind. So once you know this, once you are thinking, how do I get to the end of my story? And once you are thinking that each chapter is kind of like a miniature story within a larger one, you then ask yourself, how do I find what to put in my story? There are two ways to do this, but they're really the exact same thing. So you start with the beginning and the end, and I suggest that you also know what the climax of the story is as well. The two different ways to do this are taking large logical steps within the story or small logical steps within the story, and each follow the same pattern. You start at the beginning. You think to yourself, what is the first step in the story that is going to get me to that ending? Or you can think backward. You can think, I have the climax or the ending of the story. What brought me to this ending? What is the first thing that comes before this ending? And you add it to the story. This is actually what people are doing when they use story structures. They're looking at very big points in the story, and they're trying to create a sequence of events that fit together logically. A sequence of events that bring them from the beginning of the story to the end of the story in a way that makes sense. Now, when you do this, you need to take time figuring out what to put in each chapter. You could throw a sequence of events together in about 10 minutes that you think makes sense, but as I say again and again and again, take your time. Try to explore the possibilities, because if you do not explore the possibilities, you might just miss a golden idea. And how long this takes will depend on your story, and what you put in your story or what you put in that sequence of events will also depend on the beginning and the end and what story you are trying to tell. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.